Gordon D. Siggins, and I was in the Marine Corps from 1943 to 1946. And all the time I was in there, I never had a furlough or even a 24-hour pass. And now I start out where I was born and stuff.
Right.
Okay.
Where and when you were born?
I was born in 1925 in Highland Park, Michigan, just outside Detroit. And
Where'd you go to school?
then I went to Walter French School in Lansing, Michigan. And then I quit school just before I got in the 10th grade. And I wanted to work for a little while, like a lot of kids did, to see what it was like before I had to go into service. And I went down to the Ford Bomber Plant in Salina, Michigan, and got a job right off the bat as a riveter. And worked there for about 6-8 months. And then by that time I was 18 years old and had to go down for my physical. And I was 1A, so then they told me that I'd be going into the service within 2 or 3 months. So then my mother and dad wanted me to come back to Lansing, Michigan to work there, so I'd be with them for a while. So then I came back and started at Oldsmobile and worked there for a few months before I had to go down and find what branch of the service I wanted before I got drafted.
Why did you choose the Marines?
Well, I chose the Navy first. I wanted to get on a PT boat. And they said when you got out of boot camp in the Navy, you just had to take your chances of getting on a PT boat. And so that didn't sound real good. And then the gentleman said, the only other services you can't get in that are full is paratroops and submarines. And I didn't want either one of those. So then I chose the Marine Corps. Now what should I start?
Where did you get your basic training?
Got basic training in San Diego, platoon 1003. And all the drill instructors were all PFCs. There wasn't any sergeants like there is now. And now
Were they kindly to you?
They weren't very kindly. Now you want to start with...
When you finished basic training, where were you assigned?
And then about 7 of us, I guess it was, made PFC, and then they said, they asked if we'd like to go to Camp Elliot for some more advanced training. So then there must be about 8 or 10 of us went to Camp Elliot along with some other Marines from other platoons, and we went through some advanced training. And when we finished that advanced training, they wanted to know if we'd take more advanced training, and so they sent us to New Caledonia off of Australia. And we took more training in
Was that your
Marine Raiders.
was that your first time on the ocean going over?
That was the first time on the ship going over, and there was the President Polk, and it was a high centered ship that was bouncing like a ball, and we just left San Diego in a convoy, and one of the engines had trouble, so we had to come back to San Diego, and they worked on it all night long, and then the next morning they sent us out again in the outfit, and we went across the ocean. Took us almost a month to get to New Caledonia, all alone, zigzagging all over the ocean.
You never caught the convoy?
No, never caught the convoy. And then just when I was crossing the equator, when they had the big doings of where they beat you with the boards and
King
stuff.
Neptune?
Yeah, somebody spotted a periscope out in the water, and so they canceled all that, and we thought sure he was going to be torpedoed, but I don't know if it was American submarine or Japanese, but they didn't harm us. And So then we got to New Caledonia and for the advanced training, and then they got us all set for the Raiders, and then they disbanded both the Carlson and the Epsom Raiders in 1943 and 44, and they put me over in the 1st Marine Division in charge of a machine gun, where I had 2 ammo carriers and a BAR man, and that was in the 1st Marine Division.
Was this a light machine gun?
Yeah, 30 caliber, air cooled. They had water cooled back then, but then after about a year, they decided the water cools were just too darn heavy carrying the water and everything for the guns. So then they disbanded most of the water cools and just had those in places where they could mount them down and permanently. And then they gave all the rest of it as the air cooled. And then when we first got in there, we was issued Thompson submachine guns, and we thought this was really something. But then for some reason, they took the Thompson machine guns away from us and gave us the Grand M16s, the regular heavy rifles. We had to carry those along with the machine gun and the ammo and stuff. Then, let's see, we went from New Caledonia.
Was this, which was your first combat experience?
That was on Peleliu.
Okay.
That was the first.
But that was after you went to Caledonia.
That was, yeah, but after we went there, we went to a little island by the name of Puvavu, and we had the training, and we was told that we was going to hit another island within a month, and that was Peleliu, and then we went into.
What were the fortifications you faced? What were the defensive measures the Japanese had there?
On Peleliu?
Yeah.
Oh, they was really dug in. They had great big, like hospitals and big outfits underground even. When the first morning, when we was gonna hit the island, we went up on deck, and all we could see the complete island off about 8 miles, I guess it was. And it was nothing but a ball of fire and smoke, and we thought, how can anybody ever be on that island? But then when we got in.
This was from the bombardment that
Yeah, yeah, this was from the Navy ships and heavy cruisers and battleships and stuff.
How long did they bombard it before you?
Oh, they was bombarding it for quite a while. And
days?
Yeah, days. And then the Navy sent planes and frogmen in to check the island, but they didn't realize, I guess, that all this barbed wire was underwater by about 2 feet. And then when our landing barges came in, they all got caught on all this barbed wire, and then some of them got hit with the 77s and the mortars and tipped over, and then all the guys were caught on the barbed wire with their backpacks and their rifle straps and their canteens and cartridge belts, so they couldn't get off. There were just hundreds of them caught in this barbed wire.
It was the first wave?
That was first and second wave, and then we couldn't get into the landing barges, so they turned around, and we all started back out to the mother ship again, and we thought they was going to abort the landing, and we thought they was going to take us on the troop ship again. And we got out there and went around in a circle, must be for hour and a half in the hot sun, and they told us not to drink too much of the water because there wasn't any more water when you got on land. So we were just sipping the water out of the canteens, and then we got on, off in the distance we could see all these, what they called buffaloes and alligators. There was all the amphibs, and we had to change all our stuff in the fairly rough oceans over the side into the amphibs, and then we went back in to our landing. I forgot which shore we were supposed to hit, whether it was Red or what it was.
Which beach?
Which beach. And then they couldn't get us in there, so then they took us down to another beach, and landing craft couldn't get in there. Then they took us down to a beach where some of the landing craft was getting through, and so we tried to get through there, and our ammo trailer on the back of the amphib got caught in the barbed wire. So then one of the Navy guys and a Marine Corps guy got over the back and unhooked it, and then we finally got in. But then we was way a long ways from where we were supposed to go in.
From your objective.
We was right by the landing strip, and we were supposed to be a long ways from there. So then it was starting this was in the afternoon now, and then finally when we did get in and got on land, that's about 50% of the Marines' worries is getting in on land, and you don't want to get stuck out in the water. And then we finally got in there, and then we started working our way inland, and we must have only went in about maybe a half a block, and we was getting hit so hard with mortars and artillery that we started to dig in, and so then it started to get dark. And then later on that night we heard tanks coming across the landing strip, and we was hoping that they wouldn't come in our direction, which they didn't. And then next morning when it finally started getting daylight, it was so nice to see daylight. And then we looked out on the landing strip, and here was the Japanese tanks. Some of them got knocked out. We don't know what they got knocked out from, if they got knocked out from their own 77s or if they got knocked out from the American 75s or whatever they had, or from the ships. And then we started inland across the landing strip, and we went by one of the tanks, and one of the guys was saying that his dad's Dodge had heavier metal in than what the Japanese tank had. And then we looked at the one tank, and here it has like a 55-gallon drum welded on the back and open at the top, and we was wondering what the heck that was for. And later on we found out that they would put a Japanese in there with a machine gun, so, and he was to protect the back of the tank. And everybody said that was just something that was like a suicide thing to get in that 55-gallon drum where there was no way out. And then we left there and worked.
Did you have any air cover in this first day?
There was a few Corsairs flying over, and the Corsair pilots, you'd see them going down beneath the palm trees, and you'd see a big explosion, and you'd think, oh man, they crashed into the ground. And then about a quarter of a mile away, you'd see them come back up again, and they turn their wings back and forth, and it was all right. And
were they bombing?
They were strafing.
Strafing,
yeah. And some of them had napalm, but most of them just strafed. And then later on that day, that was the second day that we was up on kind of like a little ridge, and there's a lot of Japanese and Americans. In fact, the first and second day I saw more dead Marines and wounded Marines than I saw ones that were standing up that could fight. And then we kind of dug in up on this little knoll, and we always heard that the Japanese were small guys, and there was a guy Japanese kind of buried in the dirt, and a coral, and here's a head here, and then there's some feet about, looked like 8 feet away. And we thought this must be 2 guys, and it was a Japanese Imperial Marine that was guarding the front of the island there, and he must have been 6'4" or something like this. And we thought, what on earth are we doing over here fighting these kind of guys? They told us we was going to fight little guys.
What kind of, as you were attacking, what kind of fortifications were you running into?
We was running into mostly, there's a lot of caves and a lot of, I think they had like 20 years to fortify this island, and they had a lot of like pillboxes, sort of like pillboxes, and they had a lot of caves and everything where they was dug in. And then later on, maybe a week or so later, when we was kind of securing the island a little bit, you'd see little kind of stacks and smoke, and you could smell the opium, where they was smoking the opium down in these places, and the smoke would be coming out, and guys would drop hand grenades down in those things, but didn't seem like it bothered anything. They must have been deflected off into someplace else, and you could hear the Japanese down there kind of talking and laughing, where most of them were so probably far out on that opium they didn't even know what was going on. And then we finally secured the island, and then we went back to.
How many men were in your unit, in your wave going in?
There must have been about maybe, in the first unit, I'd say maybe.
Was this a battalion? Was this a battalion?
Well, this was the whole Marine Corps division, but at that time, I think the Marine Corps 1st Division was only about 8,500 men, because they got hit so hard on Guadalcanal and Bougainville.
Okay.
And so the division was way down. And I think at this time, there's like about 8,500 men that went in, and I think they said only about 4,500 came back off without being wounded or dead.
So you had really gone in the division as a replacement after Guadalcanal?
Yeah, replacement after Guadalcanal.
How many of you were in, do you remember how many of the replacements there were going in? How many would have been in your group?
There must have been, I'd say maybe 600 maybe. There was, quite a few replacements, but because the division was so low from all of them that got killed on Guadalcanal.
Killed or sick or whatever.
Yeah. And then on one other thing on Peleliu, we got in there, and the 2nd or 3rd day we didn't have any water, and there's like a little kind of like a shell hole or a pond or whatever it was, and it had all this slimy old water in it with the dead Japanese and dead Marines laying all around it. And then the corpsman said, there's no water, you're going to have to fill up your canteens about 3/4 full and put one of your iodine pills in it and shake it around for 10-15 minutes and then just sip it, and I think you'll be all right. But we did this, and about 2 or 3 days later, a whole lot of us came down with hepatitis and yellow jaundice and stuff, and then they took us out of the front lines and put us back in the boondocks and cots and tents, and we stayed back there for 2 or 3 days. Everything we tried to eat a C ration, and it'd come right back up again, and we tried to eat a K ration, and it'd come right back up again. And then Marine Corps doctors were in there, and they didn't know what was wrong with us, and then they brought in a couple of naval doctors, and the naval doctor said, well, you can tell what's wrong with them. There's something wrong with their livers, because their eyes and everything are all yellow. And the Marine Corps doctor said, well, all the Marines' eyes are all yellow, and they even sweat yellow because they take Atibrun every day for malaria. And he said, well, these guys have got something wrong with their livers. So then he said, we're going to send in sugar and grapefruit juice, and mix the sugar with the grapefruit juice until it's like a syrup, and let them sip on this and see what happens. And they did this, and maybe a day or two after that, we'd start eating C ration or K ration and stay down. Then we pulled out of that, and then they sent us back into combat until the island was secure. Then they sent us back to Puvavu Island again for a rest. And on Puvavu Island, the one day, we looked down the beach, and here comes 4 Piper Cub airplanes, and they flew over our head. And in the first one was Bob Hope, and second one was Jerry Colonna, and then the third one was Frances Langford, and then the fourth one was a young girl that none of us knew who it was. Then they had a USO show, and they said Bob Hope was in one of the big islands close to there, and he heard that the Marine Division just got off of Peleliu, where they lost about half of the division, and so he thought he'd put on a show for him, and that's where they put on a nice USO show for the guys. And then they told us to start preparing, because in a month or so he's going to hit another island, and that was Okinawa.
When you were fighting on Peleliu, do you have any trouble with your weapons, maintaining them? Did they have any trouble with ammunition supply?
No, it seemed like all the weapons worked really well. Once in a while, the Garands would get a little bit of sand in them, but all the scouts and snipers, they all had Springfields, bolt actions, and those things seemed like they worked if they was full of sand or not, and those were good. And then when we went into Okinawa, they took all the Grand M116s and gave us all carbines, which was a lot lighter and a lot nicer to handle. And,
they did not have the stopping power.
No, they weren't. The Grands, those were, and I always wished that the Marine Corps, when they had the Grands, they all had the wind things on the sights for windage and stuff, and nobody knew, when you're on an island, how are you supposed to know where the wind is going? So I always wish that they just had just the straight sights, and I think when you went to the rifle range, I think the guys would have done a lot better if they would have just had straight sights instead of all the windage where there's monkeying around with. We didn't even know what he was doing with the windage and stuff. And then when we left Puvavu, we went to Guadalcanal for some more training, and then we left for.
Did you get replacements in that period?
Oh yes, got a lot of replacements, and then we left and started off to Okinawa. Of course, we didn't know it was Okinawa. And on board ship going, they had Tokyo Rose on loudspeaker, and she was saying the 1st Marine Division, you really got hit hard on Peleliu, but on Okinawa, when you go in, it's going to be just like a picnic. No firing or anything. And we thought, oh, this is a bunch of baloney. She's just telling us this. But then when we got into Okinawa and left the ships and went into with the landing barges, there was very little firing. There's some small arms fire and stuff, and we looked at each other and says, Tokyo Rose was sure 100% right. And it was so nice. But then a few days later, I was up on kind of a little knoll with the machine gun and the other 2 or 3 guys, and out in the ocean, there were so many ships you couldn't even count them. You couldn't believe how many ships. And here, all at once, all the ack was going up, and here we could see Japanese Zero come over top of all these ships, and all these ships were firing, and you wondered how anybody could try get a plane through there. Then he came just over top of us where we could even see his face and stuff. He was just about tree level right over top of us, and then he just went maybe about a half a mile in and strafed and turned around and right back over us again, and then through all these ships and all this ack, and we saw him out there turn around again and back through all the ships again with all this black ack, just black. And he come right back over top of us again, we could see him again, and then he dropped a bomb. And all of us said, why on earth didn't he drop that bomb the first time he went over instead of strafing and carrying that bomb with him all the way back up there? But then he dropped a bomb, and I don't know if he hit a ammo place or what he hit, but it really blew up about half a mile from us. Then he turned around and went back, and he only got about halfway, and he just went down in a ball of fire. So one of the guns hit him.
He was not a kamikaze.
No, he wasn't kamikaze.
Did you see any kamikazes there?
Nope, I never saw any kamikazes. And but we was there. I forgot what day that was. That must have been a week or so later when the typhoon hit, and that we could see out in the ocean these great big chains that were holding this docks and stuff. The links must have been 10 or 15 pounds. There was great big links, about maybe an inch and a quarter steel been around for these big links, and the typhoon was snapping those off just like they was string. It was, you couldn't believe the power of that wind. And then all of our all our tents went sailing out to sea and was blowing, all our tents were down and blown away. And then one of the guys the next day when the typhoon quieted down came there, and he says, he was at the landing strip, the Navy landing strip there. He said, we saw your 8-hole head go sailing out to sea on our landing strip.
The head being the sanitary facility.
Yeah. He said it really went sailing out there. But then after the typhoon, it was sure a mess around there with all the docks floating, and it took them quite a while to get that in.
Okinawa was where the Japanese had changed their strategy, not to defend the beaches,
Right.
but to put all their strength and fortification further inland.
Yeah, about the third, I guess it was about the third day, then we really got hit. But it was so nice if a Marine can get in and get on the sandy beach, that, like I said before, that's about 50% of your troubles. And then one day they wanted volunteers for mission, and they said there was only about 50% chance of getting back alive, and nobody would volunteer. It wasn't like the John Wayne movies where everybody's jumping up and down wanting to volunteer. So then they called about 40 of us out and had us count off by tens, and then they said all the threes step forward, and I happened to be at 3, and my friend Jerry Cox from Kansas, he was at 3, and then there was about 3 other guys from another outfit that we didn't really know very well. They was 3s, and then they said, well, here's your volunteers, and everybody applauded. And then they had to have a truck driver, so then they go to the truck pool and got the truck driver, and he said to the truck driver, how did they get you? And he said, we had to draw cards, and he said, I drew a 2. And he says, so I'm the truck driver. I volunteered for the truck driver. And then we just started going through this valley where the Japanese had this valley where they could hit about any square foot that they wanted to hit.
Was this a recon patrol or a combat patrol?
No, this was what we was on. We was only on we just had one 10-wheeler, and it was full of 75 ammo, and 30 caliber ammo in a water trailer.
For the resupply mission.
Yeah, to bring up to the 75 howitzers, which I was the machine gunner in front of them. But they was already up there, so we had to bring this 10-wheeler up full of this ammunition and stuff. And we only got about halfway through the place, and the Japs opened up, and the shells and stuff was coming so close that the truck driver stopped and he says, "We better take cover." And all 5 of us ran over to like a little knoll and crawled behind the knoll all together, and must be a 77 hit right on top of us, and it knocked us out, and I could just hear like big grinding wheels in my head, and I thought, oh, I must be dead. And then when I heard Jerry Cox hollering for me, and he said, "Are you all right?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm all right." Then we looked over to the other 3 guys, and they was just torn to pieces. And then we went up to the, excuse me for a minute, we went to, there was a cave, and Jerry Cox and I thought we better get up to that cave and get where there's out of the line of fire and stuff. And so he got up to the cave, and he said, "Boy," he said, "my head is killing me." And I said, "So is mine." I said, "I got an awful headache." And we leaned against each other in the cave, and just luckily there wasn't any Japs in there. And then we both of us don't know what happened, but the next day they said we came walking into we're in our camp where we started from, and how we got there we never knew. And Jerry Cox came to visit me in Grand Rapids about 2 or 3 years after that, and even at that time he says, "Do you remember what happened?" And I said, "I have no idea what happened." And he says, "Neither have I." And then shortly after that, when we got back, Ben Sprouse was from Texas, real nice. He was our sergeant, and we was going out on a little exercise to check the area around our position there. And the day before that, he got a Dear John letter from his wife, and he just wasn't himself. And we was out checking the area, and he was going awful close to these caves, and I hollered to him, and I says, "You shouldn't do this." I said, "We got warned that there's still Japs in all these caves," and he said, "Oh, I'll be all right." And then just then a Jap lifted up from what they call a spider hole. It's about maybe 3 or 4 feet around and 4 feet down to the ground, and threw a grenade, and it hit just within a foot of him, and blew him all to pieces, and killed him. And then just like that, there's 2 other Marines appeared. I don't know where they came from. And so the 3 of us threw hand grenades up to the spider hole, and one of the grenades, I don't know whose it was, went into the spider hole, and all at once, all the parts of the Japs come flying all over and splattering all over you. It must have knocked the Jap into 1,000 pieces. And then we took Ben Sprouse's body back, and then shortly after that, maybe a few weeks after that, the island was secured. Then we went back to, I believe it was Guadalcanal again. I get all the islands where we went mixed up. I think it was Guadalcanal again. And then then the war was over. And then we decided that we'd be going home, and they told us everybody that had 50 points or more would be going home immediately. And I had almost 60 points. So I thought, boy, I'm finally going to go home. And they sent us all down to different ships, and they said, "You people get on this ship, you people get on this ship. And they put me on a ship with these other guys. He was telling the Navy guys on the ship we're so happy we were going home. And he says, you're not going home, you're going to China. And I said, how can I go to China? I said, I got 60 points, and 50 points you go home. And then the lieutenant come around there and he says, all you guys enlisted for the duration of the war plus 60 months, so you're going to China. And so they sent us to China. In China, when we first got there, it was nice and warm and stuff, and all we had was summer clothing, and we had to stand guard duty, which was all right. Then China came into the winter time, and it was down below 32, and we was just freezing out standing on guard duty with our summer clothing.
What were you guarding?
If I tell you if I tell you what I was guarding, you would laugh your head off.
Well, tell me.
Garbage dump. A garbage dump, and some of us was guarding a Chinese cemetery, and then we had our rifles and stuff, and we had little fires and stuff, and every once in a while the communists would fire a couple shots at you, and you'd fire back, but you wouldn't see where he was fired. You just fired back at him at nighttime, and they would see your fire, so you could hear a bullet now and then whiz by. And then one night, one of the guys saw where the flash came from, and he fired back. And the next morning he went over there, and there was some blood in the snow. And the snow wasn't very deep, it was only like an inch deep. And he reported that, and then the colonel was madder than Dickens, and he says, you guys are gonna kill somebody. And he said, well, they're firing at us, how do you expect not us to fire back? He said, well then, from now on, he says, you guys are all gonna be issued Remington 12-gauge shotguns, so they don't carry. And from that day until the day we came back, we had Remington 12-gauge shotguns, so they wouldn't carry that far. And everybody in the outfit said, isn't this stupid? And where they can fire at us now and we can't fire back. And then they had a raid on one of the little villages where we was at French, I forgot what it was now, and they pulled a raid about 2 o'clock in the morning on this little village.
Marines did?
Marines did, and got everybody out of the houses and went through the houses, and they found a whole 1 ton, that's big, like a big pickup truck, full of ammo and grenades and rifles and everything else just in this one little village. So they confiscated all that. And then finally, after a couple months, we came back, and I finally got back home again. And then when I got back home again, they said, well, before you go back home and send you home, we'll have to put a tooth back in your head, because I had a toothache, and when you're in the service overseas, they wouldn't fill any of your teeth, they just pulled them out if you had a toothache. They said, if you're lucky enough to survive, we'll put another tooth in there. Then I had 3 big open sores on the bottom of my feet that they was gonna do something with those, and they said, you'd probably go home in a month or so later. And I said, I don't want all this stuff, I just want to get home. So then I just got home, and I went to a doctor and got a dentist and got a tooth in, but the tooth never worked right. So I snapped it out the 3rd or 4th day, and that's still home in a dresser drawer on the top. And my feet, for about a month or so, were with the open sores. I'd have to kind of soak in the bathtub for maybe 10-15 minutes in a warm bathtub to get my socks off. But finally those healed up, but I still have a little problems now and then with with my feet. And they said, now why don't you get in the reserves and get some of that easy money? And I said, I don't want to have anything to do with the service anymore. And then about maybe a year and a half, 2 years later, whatever it was, when the Korean War came, they said if I would have been in the reserves, I'd have had to go back to Korea. So I was so happy that I didn't get in the reserves and get some of that easy, what they called easy money.
And when they did have that recall, they took the combat veterans first.
Oh yes, yeah, well yeah, they said and my outfit was on that Fujian Reservoir, wherever it was, where they got really hit again. So it was lucky I didn't get in the reserves. And so that's about the end of that.
We're looking back on it, Gordon. How did your service in the Marines, including the combat and everything else, how did it affect your life after the war?
Well, even now, I don't think of any of the bombings or Okinawa or anything like that, but I do wake up sometimes in the morning, about maybe 4 o'clock in the morning, and I'll think of all those young guys caught on the lock wire, and I get a tear come down my face.
But how did did that service affect your attitude and what you did in afterlife?
Oh, I don't know, everything after I got out of the service, like it seems like nowadays, all the people get out of the service all want to get money for the rest of their life, you know. Like here a while back, some girl came back from the, I guess it was
Iraq?
No, it wasn't Iraq, it was maybe the Gulf War maybe. And here she was on, big picture over on the front page of the paper, where she was American hero, and come to find out she's riding around a Jeep with some guy and ran across the enemy, came up to the enemy and gave them the Jeep and gave them the ammo and the weapons and stuff, and then they took her to a prisoner of war camp for a short time, and she came home. And I thought, boy, if I would have done that in the Marine Corps, they would have killed me. You know, you couldn't just go up to the enemy and give them, because they, all the time I was in the service, we never took a prisoner. We never, so they pounded in our head, we don't want you to take any prisoners, so we didn't take any prisoners. We had to kill them all. And,
you never saw very many Japs surrender, did you?
Didn't see. No, they would fight to the end, and that was our attitude too. And then that girl that came back, the American hero, a few months later we heard that it was in the paper that now she's got a headache, and she put in for disability for the rest of her life. You know, and all these guys, like when we came back with hepatitis and all this stuff, we never put in for any money. We just, in fact, I never even had a GI loan when we bought a house or anything. I never took any money for school or anything. But nowadays it seems like everybody that gets out, when they come home, they all expect to have, you know, so much money the rest of their life. And
it's a different world, isn't it?
Yeah, different world. And that's about it, I guess.
Do you ever see any of the men you served with? You mentioned one guy.
Oh yeah, I saw. We went out to Kansas, and we saw this Jerry Cox again, and then we saw two of the other guys I was in the service with, but they're all dead now. Jerry Cox died maybe 3 or 4. What was that? About 12 years after the war, of a massive heart attack. And then another guy that I was in the service with, I stopped to see him, and his neighbor says, I don't ever know what happened. He lived next door to us with his wife and 2 little kids, and just one night they all disappeared. He says, I don't know if they packed up and left, but some of their stuff is still in the house, and people have sold the house again, but he said, I don't know whatever happened to the family. He just up and left. So I don't know if he got that from the service or what, you know? Yeah.
But you ever stop and think that, as rough as it was, and all that time you never even had a one-day pass? No furloughs?
Never had any furloughs. The only time I got into any relief was over in when they send us like on MP duty into town or something. And then we could go into town like for a few hours or maybe a day, but we always had to be back in camp that night in case something happened. No, all that time, a little over 2.5 years, I never had a furlough or even a 24-hour pass.
But you do take pride and satisfaction in knowing you were a Marine. In the heart, you're still a Marine.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, I wouldn't, you know, as bad as it was in boot camp and stuff, and everything else, everything put together, it didn't affect my life, you know, really bad. You know, like a lot of guys, they said that, especially Vietnam, they said a lot of those guys come back, and of course they had, a lot of guys in Vietnam had, you know, was on dope and stuff because they had access to it. And I suppose in World War II, if I had access to dope, I would have tried dope also, or marijuana, because it was always making all kinds of what they call jungle juice.
Oh, yeah.
And they put it in the 5-gallon water cans, and then after about, we'd steal all this grape jelly from the
sea rations.
yeah, out of the sea rations, and then we'd make all this what they call jungle juice and the raisins that they would get and stuff, and then we'd have to strain it because it was so strong in the 5-gallon water buckets. It would take out all the cream-colored like enamel in there and eat all that, so we had to strain it. And then the guys would have a sip of it and make an awful face. They said, God, is that ever good?
Is that smooth?
Yeah. Yeah.
Gordon, you've given us a lot of background, and that background will be passed on to future generations, because our job at the Michigan Military History Institute is to try to pass on to the future generation what happens when our country lets its guard drop to its knees like we did after World War I, and the sacrifices that people like you and all the others of us that served had to make to stay free, and that we paid a price for that freedom, and you certainly did. But it's been a pleasure meeting you.
And it's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you.